I saw my wife's boss give her flowers at the company party, a bouquet of white lilies, right there in front of everyone, amid toasts, smiles, and music drowned out by side conversations. She smiled in surprise, with a blush that wasn't that of someone offering polite thanks. It was the embarrassed, satisfied smile of someone who felt desired. A smile I knew, because it had once been mine. I walked toward them, took a deep breath to contain the metallic taste spreading in my mouth, and said, without shouting, but firmly enough to silence the room, "Accept freedom too, because our marriage ends here." Her smile died instantly, slipping from her face like makeup in the rain. I turned and walked, feeling my chest shatter into shards inside me, but my feet moved forward with the dignity I still refused to lose. In the days that followed, she tried to embrace her boss's charm. And perhaps for a few moments, she believed his gaze would have the same devoted glow mine carried when she walked past in a wet towel in the hallway, or when she laughed awkwardly at her own jokes. She might have thought she'd found a new love. But time is a slow and merciless judge. Soon she would discover she wasn't special, just another one of the many he collected, like trophies without sentimental value. It was then that she began to face the emptiness of her own choice, and there was no echo of my name, no scent of our room, no memory of lazy Sundays under the covers. As she descended the steps of her own error, I learned to walk again. It wasn't easy. The first few days were filled with silence. The second, with anger. And the third, with a grief only those who have been betrayed by someone they swore eternal love know. It hurt to see her toothbrush still in the bathroom, the book dog-eared on page 53, the wool sweater forgotten on the back of the sofa. It hurt even more to remember the plans, the promises, the nights she held my hand and said, "With you, I am stronger." Everything fell apart in a matter of seconds, and it wasn't because of something that died naturally. It was by choice. Cold, silent, conscious. For weeks, I wondered where I went wrong. If I was too predictable. If I loved routinely. If I didn't notice the new haircut or the different shade of lipstick. But as time passed, I understood that it wasn't about what was missing in me, but about what overflowed in her: neediness, ego, a desire for novelty disguised as passion. She didn't cheat on me because I was too little. She cheated on me because, deep down, she never knew the value of what she had. It took time, but true love isn't lost, it transforms. And it was on a random day, without warning, that I encountered a new gaze. A gaze that didn't compare me to anyone, that didn't measure gestures, that didn't expect surprises to feel loved. It was a gaze that appreciated presence, silence, and effort. A clean gaze, without history, without hurt, without pending issues. There, amidst the rebuilt everyday, I found love again. A simple love, that required no proof. Just presence. Months later, she appeared. Knocking on my door as if seeking shelter from the storm itself. Her hair was loose, her makeup was off, her eyes puffy from crying that seemed to have lasted for nights. She said she missed our home, our smell, our routine. That she felt empty, and that she had realized how much she loved me too late. I listened to her. With the same silence she used when she let our love slip through her fingers. And then I was honest, I forgave. But forgiveness isn't an invitation to return, it's the key that closes the door calmly and peacefully. She didn't understand at first. She tried to insist. She tried to appeal to the memories, to the good times, to what we'd built. But the difference was that now, I was the one who was whole. My heart was clean. And there was no longer room there for the one who had trampled on everything sacred. But what she never knew, what no one knew, and what perhaps she only realized too late, was what I did with everything she left behind. One day, while cleaning her room in the old apartment I had left behind, I found a forgotten box. Inside were our photos, notes, movie tickets, maps scribbled with travel routes that never happened. I considered throwing it away, but true love isn't extinguished with anger, it needs to be ended with dignity. So I carefully packed everything, placed it inside a white box, tied it with a blue ribbon, and left it on her doorstep, along with a note. These dreams once had an owner. Today, they live at a different address. What she did after that, I don't know. But I heard she became quieter, that her smile was never the same, that she started hoarding dried flowers instead of receiving fresh ones. And even surrounded by new people, she never found a place where she felt at home. Because sometimes, the love of your life isn't the one who knocks you off your feet. It's the one who teaches you how to walk. And when you trade that person for a moment of vanity, all that's left is silence. But, what did she feel when she opened that box? Did she cry? Did she regret it? Did she try to write something and tear the page before finishing? Did she keep the note? Or did she finally understand that true love, when it leaves, doesn't bring hate, it brings absence? And that is the most painful punishment of all. Maybe she spent nights rereading our old messages, trying to find some sign that I would return. Maybe she even tried to retrace her steps, relive memories, visit the places where we were happy. But there is no return for those who left of their own free will. All I know is that day, as I closed the door after watching her leave for the last time, I didn't feel anger. Or longing. I felt peace. And that peace was all she could never find again. But how did it all begin? What caused such a solid story to quietly shatter? Where, exactly, does the turning point in a marriage lie? And is it really possible to rebuild something after trust is lost? That's the story I'm going to tell you now. Word for word. From the beginning, to the end. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize any form of betrayal. All stories are fiction, created to show with intensity how infidelity destroys homes, corrodes feelings and leaves irreversible scars. Our purpose is clear: show the truth behind every wrong choice. Prepare yourself. You are about to hear a story shocking, realistic and unforgettable. Their story began simply, like so many others, but with that sparkle in their eyes that only beginnings can convey. Miguel was a serene man, with a firm voice and an observant gaze. He was 38 years old, had a solid career in civil engineering, and a calmness that made him seem older than his years. He was the kind of person who didn't talk much, but when he did, everyone paid attention. His reserved manner hid a sensitivity few could access. He was passionate about details, daily rituals, Sunday family lunches, and writing down special dates in his phone's calendar so he never forgot to surprise those he loved. Sophia was the complementary opposite. 35 years old, communicative, vain without exaggeration, ambitious in the right measure. She worked in the marketing department of a multinational company and enjoyed the bright lights, the long conversations, and the feeling of being noticed. She had an energy that filled the room and a natural charm that effortlessly drew attention. Her laugh was loud, her presence striking. But next to Miguel, she became calmer, more intimate, softer. They balanced each other as if they were two ends of the same bridge. Their first meeting took place in a downtown cafe, one of those that seems frozen in time. Sophia had an open book, headphones on, and a half-empty cappuccino. Miguel wandered in by chance, looking for a quiet spot to review a project, but coincidence led them to sit next to each other. It was she who struck up a conversation, commenting on the title of the book he was carrying. Between one exchange and another, they discovered they had much more in common than they'd imagined: a love of old movies, a passion for small towns, a habit of silently observing people. The connection was quick, but not rushed. They dated for 2 years before deciding to get married. The wedding was simple but elegant. It took place on a farm, with few guests, under the open sky and decorated with wildflowers. The vows were handwritten, and Miguel, despite not being good with words, moved everyone when he said that Sophia was his home, even on stormy days. She responded by saying that, with him by her side, she discovered that peace could also be intense. The ceremony had a realistic fairy tale feel, without exaggeration, but with a truth you could touch. During their first years of marriage, they lived in a small apartment with few pieces of furniture and many ideas. They shared bills, commitments, and dreams naturally. They had a routine of making pizza together on Fridays and walking in the park on Sundays. Miguel insisted on making breakfast on Saturdays, while Sofia liked to organize the following week's schedule. They had their disagreements, like any couple, but they always found a way to get back on track. Communication between them was the foundation of their relationship, honest, open, and often raw, but necessary. Little by little, life expanded. Miguel grew within the company and began coordinating larger projects, which increased his responsibilities but also his rewards. Sofia, meanwhile, began to be recognized for her creativity and dedication, and rose a few steps up the company ladder. With the new positions came travel, constant meetings, ambitious goals, and longer nights. The daily grind began to alter their dynamic. There were no longer as many Friday pizza dates or Sundays in the park. Kisses before leaving for work became automatic, and dinner conversations became shorter. Even with these changes, both seemed aware of the phase they were in. Miguel, always rational, understood that love isn't static and believed the important thing was to endure, even in the coldest moments. Sofia, on the other hand, tried to find small gestures amidst her exhaustion that would reconnect her with him, a text message during the day, an unexpected compliment, a glass of wine before bed. They still hugged like someone finding shelter, but the frequency of these embraces diminished with each passing month. The house where they lived was now larger, more beautiful, with a large balcony, linen curtains, and walls decorated with travel photos. But there were days when the silence between them weighed more heavily than any piece of furniture. Miguel spent more time focused on spreadsheets, projects, and clients. Sofia, immersed in campaigns and tight deadlines, found herself increasingly surrounded by people, but, curiously, more alone. The messages exchanged during work hours still existed, but they were more about shopping lists and reminders than about feelings. Despite this, there were no constant fights, no aggression, no open neglect. What existed was the invisible danger of routine, the kind of wear and tear that doesn't explode, it just slowly crumbles. Miguel believed they were fine, that true love is exactly this, continuing even when passion gives way to partnership. He was quietly proud of the woman he had married. Whenever he spoke of her to friends, it was with admiration. And even in the moments when he felt her emotional absence, he preferred to believe it was just fatigue. Sofia, for her part, lived in a mixture of gratitude and restlessness. She knew she had a good, loyal, and present man by her side. But within her, a confused desire for novelty, for rediscovery, for feeling alive in a different way, began to emerge. It wasn't dissatisfaction with Miguel, it was a dissatisfaction born within herself. She began to feel that the days were passing too quickly, that the hours were slipping away, that she no longer recognized herself amidst so many demands. She tried to disguise this emptiness with commitments, meetings, and practiced smiles. Company parties became frequent. Sofia, now in a prominent position, was always called upon to represent the team, present results, and participate in get-togethers. Miguel accompanied her whenever he could. He enjoyed seeing her praised, observing from afar what a confident and intelligent woman she was. But over time, he began to feel a little out of place at these events. The conversations revolved around goals, strategies, and terms that didn't concern him. Even so, he insisted on being by her side, out of respect, love, and presence. They still slept together every night, still shared the same bed and the same roof. But emotionally, they were beginning to occupy different rooms. Not for lack of love, perhaps due to excessive fatigue, or a subtle lack of attention. The kind of failure that's only noticed when it's already caused invisible cracks. Miguel continued trying to maintain the small rituals. He'd make her chamomile tea when she worked late, stop by the bookstore to pick up that book she'd casually mentioned, buy her favorite wine even without a special occasion. Sofia noticed these gestures, but she no longer felt the same emotion as before. Not because she was cold, but because something inside her was changing. It was as if a part of her was searching for something she couldn't even name. And this feeling, so confusing and poorly explained, began to grow silently. But there, in that beginning, there was still time. There was still affection. There was still a solid history, built with care, with conscious choices, with sacrifices and conquests. There was still a home, a living story, a continuous line between two hearts that had met by a beautiful coincidence. There was still love, or at least the clear memory of when it was enough for both of them. What no one knew was that, deep beneath this tranquil surface, something was beginning to change. Something subtle, imperceptible to the naked eye. A small, almost naive shift. But one that, over time, would become impossible to ignore. Because sometimes the beginning of the end comes disguised as normality. And when you realize it, it's too late to go back. The routine continued, as it always does, even when something is out of place. Miguel and Sofia continued to occupy the same space, sharing commitments, dividing tasks, exchanging warm kisses at the front door before leaving for work. At first glance, nothing had changed. They continued to frequent the same places, having lunch together when possible, catching up on the series they had started months before. But in the gap between one episode and the next, between a meeting and a dinner, something was beginning to silently slip through the cracks of what had once been solid. The change didn't come in bursts, but in small absences, in prolonged silences, in glances that no longer met as often. Miguel noticed the signs, but preferred to believe it was merely the reflection of a difficult phase, a momentary curve in a long road. It never occurred to him that he was facing an abyss disguised as normality. Sofia, on the other hand, felt alienated in her own life. Professional success, recent achievements, recognition from her colleagues, everything she'd always strived for now seemed weightless against the constant unease growing in her chest. There was an emotional exhaustion she couldn't name, a desire to escape from it all without a clear destination. When Miguel looked at her with the same eyes as always, she no longer knew how to reciprocate that affection. It was as if they were out of sync, speaking different languages in silence. She still cared for him, but without a soul. She still smiled, but with a filter. And when he asked simple questions like, "How are you?" she answered everything, with an automatic smile that hid a storm. Sofia's work began to demand more than usual. After-hours meetings, short trips, corporate events with mandatory attendance. Miguel, although he missed having her around, always supported her. He was never a controlling man. He believed in freedom as the foundation of any healthy relationship and, therefore, didn't question it. He trusted. And trust, for him, was the ultimate expression of love. When she said she would be late, he would leave the living room light on. When she asked not to be disturbed because she had to finish a presentation, he would prepare dinner and leave it on the table with a random note, a sweet phrase, an emoji, something that said, "I'm here." But as he did so, Sofia could no longer pretend everything was fine. In fact, the turmoil inside her had reached uncontrollable proportions. She had met the new department director during a team integration event. An older, well-dressed, confident man who knew exactly how to lead a conversation and make everyone around him feel seen. He showed interest in her ideas, praised her results, and made clever jokes at the right moments. Unlike Miguel, who was more introspective and reserved, he was extroverted, articulate, and full of stories. With him, Sofia felt her presence was celebrated, her qualities shone. And this drew her irrationally, like a moth to a flame. The rapprochement was subtle. First, long conversations at the end of the workday. Then, exchanges of messages about work matters that gradually became personal. An ill-timed compliment, a joke with a double meaning, a pat on the shoulder that lasted a second too long. Sofia found herself caught up in a silent game of flirtation that, though she knew it was dangerous, she couldn't stop. She told herself it was just vanity, a temporary distraction, something harmless that would soon lose its meaning. But the emptiness she felt every time she arrived home and found Miguel already in bed, reading, smiling tenderly at the sight of her, only intensified the guilt she hadn't yet recognized as guilt. Miguel continued to love her with the same silent intensity. He watched her silently, noticing her frequent delays, her distracted glances, the way she checked her phone more often than before. But he didn't want to fall into the trap of distrust. He knew Sophia. He knew her gestures, her essence, her values. He would never doubt the woman with whom he had shared the last years of his life. He preferred to believe it was just a turbulent phase. Maybe she was overwhelmed, maybe he wasn't doing enough to help her. Maybe she just needed more time. On a rainy weekend, he prepared dinner at home. He wanted to rekindle something between them. He chose her favorite wine, played their favorite music in the background, and lit candles. Sophia arrived tired, visibly dejected, but she forced a smile. They sat at the table and chatted superficially. He asked about her day, and she responded with short sentences. When he tried to touch her hand, she gently pulled away, saying she had a headache. Miguel smiled understandingly and said he understood. But inside, something was breaking. That night was colder than the winter outside the window. The distance between them was now evident. The words that once filled the spaces were now limited to the bare essentials. Touches were rare, glances distracted. Miguel still insisted on small gestures of affection, but Sophia no longer noticed them. She was increasingly immersed in a fantasy that grew in tandem with her reality. The company director was now part of her emotional daily life. Not just because of his physical presence, but because of the place he had come to occupy within her. She began to compare him to Miguel. And in the comparison, she forgot everything they had built together. She lived in an enchantment that clouded her sense of proportion. What had once been mere admiration became desire. And desire, an action. On the night of the company's holiday party, Miguel accompanied her as always. They arrived together, hand in hand, smiling on the outside. But Sophia was no longer there. Her gaze roamed the room as if searching for something, or someone. Miguel, though uncomfortable with the environment, insisted on staying by her side, trying to maintain a light-heartedness. He watched her affectionately, proud of the space she had earned, of the respect she emanated among her colleagues. Sophia smiled, posed for photos, and held a glass of sparkling wine elegantly. But her heart was beating fast for another reason. When the director approached, he greeted her with a kiss on the cheek that lingered longer than necessary. Miguel noticed but ignored it. He chose not to read too much into it. Later that evening, after milling around and chatting with other guests, Miguel left for a few minutes to take a phone call. Upon returning, he looked for Sophia among the tables. He didn't find her right away. He passed through the outdoor area of the ballroom and that's when he saw her. There she was, on the other side of the garden, under a tree illuminated by small yellow lights. The director was with her. They were speaking softly. He handed her a bouquet of flowers, white lilies. Sophia smiled, surprised, almost childlike. The smile of someone caught off guard by an unexpected but desired gesture. A smile Miguel hadn't seen in a long time. He walked slowly toward them. There were no more doubts. No more assumptions. He stopped before them and looked at her. The director, upon seeing him, stepped back discreetly, disconcerted. Sophia tried to hide the flower behind her body, as if it were possible to erase the evidence of something so obvious. Miguel remained firm. He looked into her eyes with a serene pain, a weariness that needed no words to be understood. Then he said, without raising his voice, but with a force that silenced the entire room, "Accept freedom too, because our marriage ends here." Her smile died instantly. She tried to respond, but no words came. Miguel waited no longer. He turned and walked away. Every step hurt, but every step freed him. In that moment, everything changed. What had been silence was now certainty. What had been doubt was now pain. But for Miguel, there was also dignity. And Sophia, there, among flowers and lights, was overcome by an emptiness that no words could fill. But what she didn't know yet, was that the worst was yet to come. The days following the separation were a shattered mirror, each shard reflecting a different version of what Sophia's life had been like. The apartment seemed larger, quieter, as if the sound of Miguel's breathing had drained the soul from the house. His clothes no longer hung in the closet, the familiar scent of his cologne had vanished from the pillows, and her morning coffee was now just another bitter drink she sipped alone in front of the window. She tried to fill her time with work, with commitments, with anything that would keep her distance from what she felt. But the emptiness was temporary. She woke up with him, went to sleep with him. The director, once so present, was now just another face among so many. Little by little, his attention faded, his compliments became rarer, his touches less frequent. She noticed, but wouldn't admit it. She still clung to the hope that she had made the right choice, that the discomfort was just the natural pain of a new beginning. Miguel, on the other hand, kept a low profile. He didn't tell anyone the details. He respected the silence. He didn't look for her, didn't call, didn't leave a message. It was as if he had disappeared from Sophia's emotional map, and this disappearance hurt more than any scream of rage. She hoped, somewhere deep inside, that he would seek her out, that he would return, that he would scream, that he would fight. But no. Miguel simply moved on. His absence was elegant and cruel. Because he didn't drag himself along. He walked. Time passed as it does when you have no one to share it with. Sophia tried to move on, tried to reclaim the image she had built for herself. She tried to go out with colleagues, tried to smile for photos she didn't want to take, tried to distract herself with the noise of the world. But there was a part of her that could no longer ignore the absence. And it wasn't just the absence of Miguel, but the absence of what they had been. The conversations that lasted late into the night, the inside jokes, the comfortable silence, the complicity that now seemed like a distant dream. She began to mentally relive each moment, trying to understand where things went wrong, and little by little, she was overcome by an unrelenting regret. One Saturday morning, she decided to organize the living room closet, which she had avoided touching since the separation. Amidst the forgotten objects, she found a small, light-colored wooden box tied with a blue ribbon. Her heart raced, as if sensing what she was about to find. Opening the lid, she saw photos, letters, notes, movie tickets, candy wrappers that only they liked. Things that seemed trivial but now held the weight of an entire world. Each object was an encapsulated memory. Each piece of paper held a laugh, a trip, a plan. At the bottom of the box was an envelope in her own handwriting. It was a letter she had written herself, years before, on their wedding anniversary. In it, she spoke about the future she dreamed of with him, about children, travel, growing old together. She read it all with blurred eyes, until she found a note from Miguel, dated just a few days before the separation. These dreams once had an owner. Today, they live at a different address. Pain pierced her chest like a sharp knife. He hadn't held a grudge. He had ended the story with respect. And that respect was the most painful thing she had ever felt. More than the silence. More than the absence. It was the realization that he had moved on, and that she, despite everything, was still there. Trapped in the past she herself had destroyed. Days later, unable to bear the weight of her own regret, she decided to seek him out. She discovered, through mutual friends, that he had moved to a new apartment, not far from the old one. She knocked on the door unannounced, her heart pounding, her mouth dry. When he opened the door, she saw in his eyes a piece she no longer recognized in herself. Miguel welcomed her politely, without coldness, but also without enthusiasm. It was as if she were now a distant memory, a chapter already read. She said she needed to talk. That she was sorry. That she'd understood everything too late. That she missed him, that nothing made sense since he'd been gone. Miguel listened in silence, without interrupting. When she finished, he simply took a deep breath and said he forgave her. That he held no grudges. That he understood his mistakes, that he'd also often wondered where he'd gone wrong, but that, over time, he'd come to understand it wasn't about failure. It was about choice. She insisted, trying to convince him they could start over, that there was still love. Miguel just smiled, a sad, serene smile. He said there was someone in his life now, that it wasn't a movie love, nor one made of grandiose promises, but a light, honest, silent love. And that, with this person, he had learned that loving also means being loved in return without having to ask. She tried to argue, but he was firm. He said he couldn't offer her what he no longer felt. That the love that once existed was cherished, but he couldn't live in the past. Before saying goodbye, Sophia asked why he had left the box on her doorstep. Miguel replied that it was everything they had built together. That she had a right to those memories, that they were hers too. But he no longer needed them to remind him of what he had been, because what he had experienced with her had been real. But now, it was just part of who he had been. He said you can't remake a broken story as if the pieces didn't hurt. That forgiveness is freedom, but it's no guarantee of return. And that sometimes, loving someone is precisely leaving them behind. Sophia left feeling the weight of every word. She thought she had lost a love. But there, in that conversation, she understood she had lost much more. She lost the look that awaited her every night, the care in small gestures, the man who, even in silence, put her first. She lost the chance to build a whole life alongside someone who loved her in the most genuine way. And all of this, because of an impulse. Because of vanity. Because of a void she tried to fill with temporary applause. Days later, when he entered his house, he saw a new box on the table. Inside, there were no mementos or old objects. Just a single sheet of paper. It was a simple but definitive note. When you threw away what we had, I kept the pain silent. Now that you understand what you lost, I hope you keep the peace I found. Goodbye. And in that moment, reading those words, Sophia knew it wasn't the end of a relationship. It was the end of a home. Of a destiny. Of everything that could have been. But what she didn't yet know, was that Miguel was keeping a secret. One last gesture that would make everything even more final. Something he had done for her, even before the betrayal, something she never imagined, and that now, she could never undo. It was on an overcast morning, as the leaves of the trees danced, pushed by an indecisive wind, that Sophia realized there was still something unresolved between her and Miguel. Even after their last conversation, even after his clear and definitive rejection, there was a restlessness within her that wouldn't go away. It wasn't about winning back her lost love, nor about erasing what she'd done. It was something deeper. An untied knot, a void that seemed to scream silently every time his name entered her mind. Days had passed since her last visit, but on that particular morning, driven by an almost desperate impulse, she returned to the old apartment where they had lived together, as if searching for traces of herself in the echo of walls that no longer belonged to her. The building seemed smaller, the elevator slower, and the sound of her own footsteps in the hallway felt like an intruder. She stopped before the door that had once been hers, the one she had once opened hurriedly, flowers in hand, longing in her heart. Now, she simply touched the wood with her fingers as if asking permission to remember. When she finally summoned the courage to knock, she was surprised by an old neighbor passing by who recognized her. Discreetly, she mentioned that Miguel had moved out months earlier, leaving everything in order, as he always did. But before leaving, she had asked for one last letter to be delivered, in case Sophia ever showed up. The neighbor hesitantly pulled out an envelope from her bag, already yellowed with age, with her name written in the handwriting she recognized by heart. Sophia got out with trembling hands. She sat on the bench in the square in front of the building and took a deep breath before opening it. The wind ruffled her hair, and the distant sound of children playing contrasted with the weight on her chest. The letter was short, but in it, Miguel wrote something that would dismantle everything she thought she knew. You didn't know it, but I had bought the house. The one you pointed out one day as we drove by, saying it looked like a place where we could start over. I didn't tell you because I wanted it to be a surprise. I was preparing everything. I had talked to the architect, planned the office you always dreamed of, even that space on the balcony for you to plant basil. The papers were signed 2 days before that party. I was going to take you there on Saturday. But you chose other flowers. She read and reread the last sentence with tears in her eyes, as if each word weighed a ton. The pain she'd felt until then multiplied to dimensions she hadn't known existed. It wasn't just regret, it was the realization that she'd destroyed not only a love, but also a future. The house, the plans, the secret care, the silent gesture of someone who still believed in us even when her eye was already elsewhere. She'd traded all of that for a fleeting fantasy, for superficial validation. She'd thrown away something true, profound, and rare for a brief moment of vanity. On impulse, she searched for the location of the house. She remembered the street, the neighborhood, how Miguel had jotted down the details when she'd casually mentioned it. He drove there, as if the answers he sought were waiting behind a gate. When he arrived, he parked across the street, breathless. The house was exactly as she remembered, a bright facade, wide windows, a simple garden. But what stopped her in her tracks was seeing someone there. A man was coming out the door, Miguel. And beside him, a woman. Not just anyone, but the same one Sophia had dismissed months earlier with a caustic remark during a company party. A kind woman with a quiet smile, who didn't wear heels or expensive clothes, who always seemed out of place among so many ambitious people. She remembered her well, because she'd always thought she was too plain to attract attention. And there she was, walking with Miguel to the gate, laughing at something he'd said, holding a bouquet of lavender that looked like she'd just picked from the garden. Sophia didn't know whether to get out of the car, scream, or cry. She felt like a ghost watching the life that could have been hers, but now belonged to someone else. She watched them walk away, hand in hand, naturally. No explosive passion, no theatrical gestures, just two bodies walking in harmony, two souls at peace. And perhaps that was the most painful part, the absence of drama, the lightness of a new love that didn't carry the wreckage of the old. On the way back, her hands trembled on the steering wheel. She couldn't breathe properly. Everything blurred together, the image of the house, the memory of the letter, Miguel's serene face, that woman's laughter. She thought about going back, about knocking on the door, about begging. But something inside her already knew it would be useless. That door would never open for her again. And even if it did, there would be no home there anymore. Only the past. That night, when he got home, he opened the closet and took out the box Miguel had left there long ago. For the first time, he had the courage to look at each object, to touch each memory with the reverence it deserved. Not as someone trying to recover what they've lost, but as someone finally accepting that it's gone. He turned on the stereo and put on one of the songs they used to listen to together. He lay down on the couch and cried. He cried uncontrollably, as if everything had collapsed at once. It was mourning. Not for the marriage, not for the man, but for the woman she had been and would never be again. In the following days, Sophia began to change. Not abruptly, but slowly, painfully, truly. She began to decline empty invitations, avoiding parties and gatherings that only served to mask the silence that devoured her. She began writing, visiting her parents more often, tending to plants. Little by little, she reconnected with what she had buried within herself, the ability to feel without rushing, to look without expecting applause, to be with someone without needing to prove herself. He wasn't seeking redemption, he was seeking understanding. And that, he now knew, would only come with time. One afternoon, months later, she received an unexpected message. It was a video sent by a mutual friend. In it, Miguel appeared alongside the woman of the house, announcing their engagement. There was no ostentation, no rehearsed speeches. It was just a simple video, recorded in the garden, with the evening light illuminating their faces. And there, in that smile of his, a serene, complete smile, Sophia finally understood that true love doesn't end in hate, nor is it revenged with anger. It departs silently, takes all that is pure, and begins anew somewhere else. On her phone screen, she paused the video and stared intently at the moment Miguel looked into the new woman's eyes. That look, yes, was the same one that had once been hers alone. But now it belonged to someone who knew how to care. Someone who knew how to recognize. And, most importantly, someone who arrived when she decided to leave. Sophia got up, put away her phone, and opened the living room windows. She took a deep breath and let the wind in. The pain was still there, but now it was accompanied by something she hadn't felt in a long time, peace. And maybe that's what Miguel meant in that letter. That love doesn't die completely. It just changes address. And when it changes, it doesn't leave a key under the mat. Sophia began to live as if walking among the rubble of a life that no longer exists. After discovering the house, the letter, Miguel's new love, and above all, the silent depth of everything she had lost, reality ceased to be a stage for hope and became a field of bitter acceptance. She no longer tried to win back, not because she had given up, but because she understood that what was broken could no longer be molded, not when the other had already moved on so far, so lightly, so fully. It was strange, even cruel, to know that the man who had been her life partner for years was now just a memory framed by a peace that did not include her. Life continued outside with the same haste as always, but inside her, time seemed slower, denser, as if the hours carried a weight that only those who regret it carry. She began to rethink everything. Every choice, every misplaced word, every silence that screamed louder than it should have. The dilemma that now consumed her was no longer about guilt or forgiveness, but about identity. Who had she become? At what point had she stopped recognizing love when it was still there, knocking on the door with hands trembling with care? The dilemma was moral, emotional, human. How could she move forward when what she left behind was the best version of herself? Because losing Miguel was losing love, yes, but it was also losing the woman she was by his side. The woman who felt safe, respected, admired. The woman who dreamed and was included in the dreams of others. She found herself faced with the task of rebuilding herself, but now without mirrors to reflect that old image, without paths to guide her steps, without a voice to whisper certainty at the end of the day. Loneliness wasn't the absence of people, it was the constant presence of a conscience that wouldn't let up. She began therapy, not to forget Miguel, but to understand herself. And in the process, she discovered that love isn't just about feeling, it's about caring, it's about protecting, it's about choosing. And she hadn't chosen to protect what they had. She had given in to impulse, to vanity, to the ephemeral. She had confused admiration with desire, attention with love. And the price of this wasn't just the end of a relationship, it was the end of a home that had been built with real bricks. Meanwhile, Miguel was experiencing a completely different phase. His new relationship was calm, without major explosions, but with a constancy that gave him security. The woman by his side didn't demand daily proof of love, didn't ask for surprises, or demand exaggerated romanticism. She simply was. She listened. She shared the silence with him. And in this simplicity, Miguel found a safe space where his pain could heal. He didn't talk about the past, didn't dwell on his wounds. He simply allowed himself to live in the present with gratitude. He knew he had loved Sophia deeply, but he also knew that some losses are necessary for one to find peace. And now, finally, he was at peace. Despite everything, there was a part of Miguel that carefully preserved the memories of what they had experienced. Not out of nostalgia, but out of respect for history. He didn't burn photos, didn't delete old messages. He kept everything stored in a box, not to reopen, but to remember that everything truly lived deserves to be preserved, even if it can never be relived. For him, Sophia was an important chapter, but not a definitive one. And this difference was what made him strong enough to carry on, while she was still trying to find herself amidst the wreckage. The unexpected turn of events came one quiet afternoon when Sophia received a call from Miguel's brother. His voice was hesitant, like someone unsure whether to share what he knew, but there was an urgency in his words that she didn't ignore. He said he needed to deliver something that had belonged to Miguel, something she might want to see. They arranged to meet at a discreet cafe. When she arrived, her heart raced, as if the past would knock on her door again at any moment. His brother arrived with an envelope in his hand. He said he'd stumbled across it while organizing Miguel's old papers and thought she deserved to see it. Inside the envelope was a purchase contract for the house he had mentioned in the letter, with a handwritten note in the bottom corner: "Deed will be transferred to Sophia, should anything happen." Beside it was a second document, an informal will, dated weeks before their separation. In it, Miguel had made it clear that, should he die, the house would be hers, along with an enclosed letter. She read it silently, her body trembling, her eyes fixed on the paper that seemed to hurt more than 1,000 words spoken aloud. It was the kind of gesture that showed that, even with the distance that already existed between them, he still cared for her behind the scenes. He still planned for the future so that, even in his absence, she would not be left destitute. The letter accompanying the will was short but definitive. Miguel said that, despite the ups and downs, he had never stopped loving her, and that if he were ever no longer there, he wanted her to have a place where she could rebuild herself. The house wasn't just a surprise, it was an emotional legacy. A shelter for the soul. A final gesture from someone who loved until the end, even when hurt. Sophia left that cafe with her soul crushed. She felt as if time had turned back, as if she were receiving love when she could no longer reciprocate it. She wondered why Miguel had done this. Why had he thought of her with such tenderness, even when she had chosen another path? The answer came not in words, but in feelings. Because perhaps true love is the kind that continues to exist, even when it is no longer reciprocated. Because there are people who love not for the return, but for the very nature of who they are. And Miguel was like that. Always was. She thought about calling him, thanking him, telling him she'd received the papers, but she couldn't. Not out of pride. Out of respect. Because she knew he didn't need to hear anything else. She'd already given everything. She'd already made clear, with actions, the kind of love she offered. And now she could only guard that with reverence, with silence, with regret. The moral dilemma surrounding her was cruel: what to do with such a great, silent proof of love that came too late. How to live knowing someone gave their best until the very last second, and all they received in return was betrayal. She didn't know how to respond. There was no answer. Only the weight of her conscience. Only the responsibility to transform that pain into something useful. And perhaps, there, between the lines of that guilt, she would truly begin to transform. Life continued, as it always does, indifferent to human suffering. But within Sophia, something had changed forever. She now carried with her a lesson that would not be erased by time, nor by other loves. I knew it wasn't just about finding someone to love, but about recognizing that love while it was there. Because love doesn't shout. Love doesn't demand. Love builds in silence. And when betrayed, it doesn't break completely, it withdraws with dignity. And never returns. It was in this new silence that Sophia would learn to live. With the windows open, her heart rebuilding, and with the certainty that when you throw away a true love, it's not just the other person you lose. It's also the most precious part of you. The one that may never exist again. Sophia began visiting the house frequently. Not to reclaim what she had lost, but because that place, even though it had never been hers in life, now held a kind of living memory that held her captive, irresistible. She always parked her car on the same corner, got out slowly, and watched from afar, behind sunglasses and loose hair, Miguel and his new life moving with a calmness she never dared ask for. It was as if each visit was a silent punishment, an unconscious way of understanding, of truly absorbing the consequences of her choices. Sometimes she saw them tending the garden together, he with his shirt sleeves rolled up, she smiling as she pointed at something in the flowers. Other times, they sat under the porch, sharing tea or a book. Nothing grand, nothing cinematic. Just two bodies in tune with the calm of those who respect each other. And that was exactly what hurt the most. There was no heightened passion, no dramatization of a new love. Everything was simple. And perhaps, for that very reason, it is impossible to break. Because peace, when born between two pure hearts, becomes unshakable. On a particularly hot afternoon, Sophia parked as usual, but as she got out of the car, something in her chest felt heavier than usual. She didn't know if it was the heat, the emotional exhaustion, or the accumulation of months of silence. She walked to the gate, unplanned, driven by a blind urgency, and rang the doorbell. It was Miguel's new wife who answered. Her gaze wasn't hostile, nor was it surprised. It was calm, attentive, as if she'd already expected, perhaps, that this moment would come at some point. Sophia asked, in a low voice, if she could speak with him for a few minutes. She hesitated for a split second, but then opened the gate and pointed to the bench in the garden. She simply said that he was out back, tending the plants. Sophia waited. Her hands were sweating. The air felt thick. When he appeared, their eyes met for a moment that lasted longer than any words. There was no more hatred, hurt, or anticipation. Only the presence of two pasts intersecting one last time. Miguel walked over to her, sat down beside her without asking why. He waited. She took a while to begin. She searched for words, but they all seemed fragile compared to what she felt. Finally, she said she had received the documents, that she had read the letter, that she had heard about the house. He nodded, without looking away. She continued, her voice breaking now. She said she didn't understand how he could still think of her so generously, even after everything. That gesture, leaving a home, a place for her to rebuild her life, was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever done for her. Miguel simply replied that he did what he felt was right at the time. That it wasn't about whether she deserved it or not, but about who he was. He said that true love doesn't disappear when rejected, it just changes form. And that in that moment, even though he had been betrayed, there was still a part of him that wanted to see her well. Sophia wiped away a tear that was falling uncontrollably and asked if he had ever regretted that gesture. He shook his head and said no, because even if she never used that house, he knew that one day she would understand its value. And that day had come. The silence between them was broken by a light breeze. The sounds outside contrasted with the intensity of the moment. Sophia then asked, almost in a whisper, if he was happy now. Miguel didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath, looked around, and then looked back at her. He said he was. Not because he'd found someone, but because he'd found himself again. He said the pain forced him to look inward, to understand that for too long he'd lived trying to please, preserve, and sustain a relationship that was already falling apart. And that, in doing so, he'd lost himself. That now, with the woman by his side, he'd found the freedom to be whole, without fear, without insecurity, without demanding things of himself for gestures that went unnoticed. Sophia then whispered that she admired him, and that perhaps she'd never truly deserved the kind of love he offered. Miguel smiled slightly. He said that deserving or not was no longer relevant. That what mattered was what he did from now on. She stood, ready to go, but first she asked if she could come into the house. Just to see. Miguel hesitated, but nodded. They walked through the garden together, and when she entered, her eyes filled with tears. Everything there bore his mark. The light wood, the neutral tones, the delicate choices. There were paintings with soft phrases, carefully arranged books, embroidered pillows. It wasn't just a house, it was a home. The home she destroyed before it even existed. Miguel said nothing. He just watched her. When she finally left, he thanked her. He said he would never forget that gesture. And before crossing the gate, she looked at him one last time and said, "I loved you. In my way. But now I know your way was the right way." He smiled, but didn't answer. He didn't need to. Some truths can no longer be expressed in words. In the days that followed, Sophia decided not to return. That visit had closed what was left. There were no more bridges, no shortcuts. Only each person's individual path remained. She began to live more honestly with herself. She avoided repeating the patterns that had led her to ruin. She faced her own fears courageously, even alone. She changed jobs, moving to a smaller company where she didn't have to work full-time. She began teaching at a community college. She dedicated herself to social causes. Not as a form of redemption, but as a genuine attempt to fill a void that could now only be filled by genuine action. Miguel, for his part, continued his quiet life. She married months later in an intimate ceremony. He didn't post photos, didn't announce it with fanfare. He only shared it with a select few. For him, love now meant silence, consistency, and presence. And with his new partner, he discovered that happiness isn't found in grand gestures, but in the simplicity of being seen, heard, and respected. He held no grudges against Sophia. He simply held the certainty that he had done everything he could, and that, because of that, he deserved the peace he now felt. And while one began anew, the other rebuilt. Each in their own way. Sophia never tried to interfere again. He learned to walk away with dignity. He decided to sell the house he had legally received. He donated half of the proceeds to a women's shelter. With the other half, he rented a small apartment and began writing. He put into words everything he felt, everything he had learned. He didn't seek fame, but meaning. And each text was an attempt to understand himself better, to help someone avoid making the same mistakes. His name was unknown, but his writing began to touch anonymous hearts, which saw themselves reflected in his words. There were days when I still dreamed of him. When I woke up and took a few seconds to remember he was no longer there. But instead of crying, I smiled melancholy. Because in the end, I had loved. I had been loved, intensely. And now I knew the difference between love and illusion. And although I couldn't go back, I could move forward with dignity. And dignity, she learned, is what remains when all else is lost. The years passed with the subtlety of someone who doesn't need to announce changes to bring about profound transformations. Names were saved in old contact lists, photos were replaced by new memories, and glances met only in the corners of memory. Sophia, now 42, had a more restrained expression in her eyes, not of bitterness, but of someone who had learned to accept the consequences of her own choices. She lived alone in a small, simple but cozy two-room apartment, surrounded by books, plants, and papers scribbled with stories that blended fiction and experience. She became a discreet writer, read by many who didn't know her face but were moved by her honesty. She wrote about love, loss, rebuilding, and time, that silent character that sometimes heals, sometimes demands. She avoided looking back, but also didn't pretend the past didn't exist. She possessed the serenity of someone who once carried guilt, but now carried wisdom. Miguel, for his part, maintained a steady and discreet life. His career had been redirected to something lighter, with occasional consulting work, free time for family, coffee on the balcony, and quiet afternoons. He and his new wife had no children, but they built a home where there was room for peace, respect, and shared projects. He never spoke publicly about his experiences with Sophia, nor did he use his story as a source of emotional vanity. He was grateful, without denying the pain. He kept some old photos and yellowed letters in a locked drawer, not out of nostalgia, but out of respect for his memory. A reminder of what he had to go through to become who he was. Life continued on parallel paths. But fate, that unpredictable screenwriter, decided that the two would meet once again, without warning, without preparation. It happened at a literary event in a small town, where Sophia had been invited to speak about her works. Miguel was there on a trip, accompanying his wife, who worked in editorial production and was part of the event's curatorship. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the room was full. Sophia was talking about a new short story, in which the main character loses the love of her life because she doesn't know how to value him, and discovers too late that love doesn't wait forever. She read with suppressed emotion, her eyes steady, but her hands slightly trembling. Miguel, sitting in the back row, recognized that voice before even seeing her face. The impact was sharp, like a punch he hadn't expected. He didn't comment to anyone. He just listened, motionless. At the end of the reading, while she signed books and chatted with readers, Miguel approached discreetly. There were no rehearsals for this reunion. Just two paths crossing for the last time. When she saw him, time seemed to stand still for a second. He was different, more mature, lighter. So was she. Their eyes met with the same intensity as years before, but without the weight of pain. She smiled, and he smiled back. Discreetly, without dramatic gestures, they exchanged a few quick words. He praised her writing. He said he recognized parts of himself between the lines. She thanked him sincerely and confessed that some stories had healed her more than any therapy. She asked if he was happy. He said yes, without hesitation. He asked if she was okay. And she, for the first time in a long time, answered yes, not because she was complete, but because she was at peace with who she had become. Before they said goodbye, Sophia handed him one of her books, without a dedication. She simply said he would understand. Miguel put the book in his coat pocket and left. That night, he read the book in one sitting. And he cried. Not out of sadness. But because he finally understood that everything had meaning. Every pain, every choice, every silence. Sophia had learned. Too late for both of us, but soon enough for herself. He never saw her again. And she never needed to see him again. They both moved on with the certainty that life doesn't repair what's destroyed by betrayal, but allows something new to blossom from the broken pieces. With her pain exposed in the pages she wrote, Sophia began to be heard by thousands of readers who, unknowingly, found in her a voice that translated what they couldn't say. She became an emotional counselor for strangers, and in every story she shared with the world, there was a silent attempt to prevent others from making the same mistakes. Once, during an interview with a literature channel, she was asked if she had ever experienced a great love. She hesitated for a moment, looked away, and replied, yes. But I didn't know how to hold on to it. And that's why I write, every day, as if each word could alert someone in time. The interviewer became emotional, and the online comments exploded. Many identified with her, many cried. But no one knew that that sentence was, in fact, the epitaph for a story that's still heard in silence. And Miguel, beside the woman he had chosen to love after the storm, lived his days unhurriedly. He spent late afternoons reading in the garden, sometimes pausing on a phrase that seemed to convey what he had experienced. He never forgot. But he also never looked back with longing. Only with respect. Life gave him a second chance, and he honored it with everything he had. He lived with serenity, and when his time to leave came, he left in peace. Without any pending issues, without open pain, only with the certainty that, when one loves fully, even loss teaches. And so ended a story that, for many, seemed already over at the moment of betrayal. But which in truth only concluded when each character understood the price of choices, the value of true love, and the irreparable pain of what is broken by ego and neglect. Sophia moved on, Miguel rested, and their story became pages read with tears in their eyes and silent reflections in their hearts. Now, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave a comment below with your opinion. How did you feel following this journey? Have you ever experienced something similar or know someone who has? Let's talk. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more moving stories like this. Here, each narrative is told with depth, respect, and truth. Our commitment is clear, never to romanticize any type of betrayal. This channel neither supports nor tolerates infidelity. On the contrary, we show, through fiction, the real pain and profound losses it causes. Always remember, betrayal destroys not only the other person, but also the purest part of the betrayer. It doesn't just destroy relationships, but futures, homes, and entire versions of ourselves. And no matter how much time heals, some losses never heal. Take care of those who love you. Respect love. Choosing someone is more than feeling, it's staying. Until the next story.